Good evening to most of you. We do, however, have a global audience, so I want to welcome our colleagues from other regions of the world. So good morning for some, good day, midday for others, and as I said, good evening for most of our participants. This is one of a series of regional summits that are taking place or have taken place already. And the objective, initially, my plan was to organize a program that would focus on the enduring and emerging issues coming out of COVID. But since we are still in the throes of COVID, the objective is to look at and take a status report on the impact of COVID on Asia as a region, and then to take a look at country by country the state, the impact of COVID on a representative sample of countries in Asia. This will all culminate in the global summit in Bahrain. It will be the first time that there will be an in-person summit and a global summit in the Middle East, in the MENA region. And we are very pleased that Darasat, which is located in Bahrain, will be our co-host for the summit. And it is obviously at a very timely moment. We have at the moment, over 50 presidents, executive directors, secretary generals who have committed to come to Bahrain from all over the world. I will just say a few opening remarks about the trends and what I have observed globally in terms of think tanks. And the main message from my standpoint throughout and the purpose of these meetings is to help connect and mobilize the global community of think tanks to respond to the pandemic. As you all know, we in early April of 2020, we organized a summit to save lives and livelihoods, and the effort was to mobilize the think tank community to be visible, to take demonstrable, concrete action to help save lives and livelihoods. We are producing and have produced a report on all of the think tanks. We then made a call for think tanks to provide case studies of what they have done in response to COVID and what specific programs and initiatives they have launched, and we have produced that and will feature in an abridged version in the Global Go-To 2021 Global Go-To report. And so the effort really is to create solidarity, to bring the global community of think tanks together, but more importantly, in this time, to underscore the importance of moving from the sidelines and on the front lines in this unfortunate, lingering, and in some cases, intensifying crisis. Over the last 12, now almost 24 months, many think tanks have been inactive, have not been engaged, and have been waiting for the pandemic to end. The reality in terms of our survival and the lingering nature of this crisis and the fact that it may become a norm requires that we rethink how we approach the operation of our think tanks. Clearly, COVID has accelerated and intensified trends that were already in place. And in fact, those think tanks that have transformed their operations and embraced new paradigms in terms of operations were able to better survive the crisis. Many think tanks, especially in developing countries around the world, have succumbed to the crisis and ceased to exist. We are, as you all know, regularly collecting data on think tanks. I am, probably to your annoyance, continually attempting to engage you. We now have over 14,000 think tanks in the database, but a significant number of them have been inactive during this crisis, many waiting for the end of the summer to begin operations. That, for many, has now been delayed till after the first of the year and may be further delayed. The reason why I'm telling you this bad news is that we need to move forward despite the crisis. We need to continue and demonstrate our capability and the operations of our institutions, and, as I've said repeatedly, to be on not on the sidelines, but on the front lines. It also means that we have to, and those that digitized, those that had online platforms, those that were had structure and a culture that was innovative and adaptive, have done quite well under this crisis. I met with the president of a think tank whose budget and staff have grown 30% during the crisis. How is that possible? It's possible because they transformed their operation well in advance in terms of having an adaptive and flexible and innovative response, both in terms of what they produce, how they produce it, and most importantly, how they communicate it. And their staff was prepared and to make those changes where many institutions still have not made the transition. I was in a major think tank in Europe in September, and in that meeting and at that institution, no one was in the office. They had were showing me around, and the institute had video screens or the hangers or the holders of video screens for digital programs, but no screens. 18 months into the crisis. The reality is that people and institutions are waiting for the crisis to over, and my message is we can't wait any longer. Our very survival as a community depends on that. And it is essential that we adopt new approaches, new paradigms that are more flexible with a quicker response time. And so this president that I met with, who has prepared his institution, said that his competitive advantage was that when every other institution was closed, his staff was working, producing programs in person and online, and that they were able to respond very quickly to the changing events in the world community. The message also that I'd like to convey is that there will be no new normal. There will be no normal. There will only be a series of abnormal events and crises. 1. 2, we are already seeing the phenomenon of hydrademics, meaning interconnected to this crisis, this pandemic, a host of other intersecting crises that are putting greater pressure on countries and policymakers. Be it supply chain, hyperinflation, labor unrest, all of these are what I would describe as hydrademics. The third element is that, and as I previously mentioned, the trends that are taking place will be intensified and accelerated. Things in terms of digitalization, etc., are being accelerated out of necessity as a result of COVID. Those things will continue, and there will be many things and many modes of operation, etc., that will fall to the wayside. And some of the things that we are engaged in now on this format will continue. And there has to be an assessment for each and every institution, what worked well, what was to our advantage, because certainly the crisis has made it possible to reach larger audiences, to engage in different ways, to produce new and innovative products, and we should continue in that mode. The final message is that in every crisis, there's an opportunity. And each and every one of you and each institution and those institutions that will survive are the ones who can see in this crisis the opportunity, can embrace it and incorporate it into their institution to their advantage. Because there is, and the only constant in the future will be change, and that will require that our institutions, as I've said, are adaptive and innovative. And so welcome to all of you. I want to thank all of the the planning committee members, and all of the speakers and panelists who are here with us today, who have generously given of their time to participate in this program, and for the host of institutions that have joined us in solidarity as a community, a global community of think tanks. I want to just quickly go over the program. As I said, there will be a regional overview, and the intent is that the speakers will look at key areas, the economy, international relations and cooperation, health, obviously, social welfare, what's the impact of COVID in each and every one of these areas, and in terms of business. The second or third panel, will focus on a country-by-country assessment to understand and see the differences in various regions across the globe. And so, without further ado, I'd like to start with the first panel. I would like Antonio from the Economic Research Institute of Asean and East Asia to give us an overview, and we start with health and public health, of what is happening in Asia with regards to this public health crisis. And I would underscore, one final point. This may go on, and the other reason from getting off the sidelines and on the front lines is this pandemic may go on for some time, one, and two, it's not the first, and there will be more and more of these, and we have to prepare ourselves as those who help the public and policymakers understand and respond to them. We need to be prepared for that new reality. Antonio.
Okay, good day, and thank you for inviting AREA, which is the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, to participate in this Asia Think Tank Summit. It's a pleasure. Presently, AREA member states include the 10 from ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, also the +3 from East Asia, that would be China, Japan, and Korea, and also another 3, India, Australia, and New Zealand. I am Anton Villanueva, and I'm from the AREA Healthcare Unit. So how has COVID-19 impacted on health and the health systems in Asia, and in this case, particularly in the AREA's countries? For the past 2 years, most will agree that it has been overwhelming. The impact of COVID-19 on health and health systems has been really overwhelming at the many levels: individual, the family, community, local government, national, regional, global, and from many perspectives, as we are about to discuss, from the social, cultural, educational, economic, scientific, and spiritual perspectives. So starting with the individual, more people now have grown more aware of the immune system health status, their own personally, and have started responsibly moving forward with proactive health trends. For example, in nutrition and exercise, more concerned with work-life balance, and avoiding potential COVID cluster areas. All of this good behavior for anyone before, during, and after any pandemic. So responsibility for maintaining good health is in. For the families, spending more time together, becoming and growing more aware of preventive and protective health measures, from wearing masks, face masks, for example, correctly at appropriate times, to maintaining general home hygiene, to caring for our vulnerable. So responsibility again for maintaining family health is also in. Now moving to communities. In Asia in particular, we've been reminded on how to respect each other's safety and how to maintain a clean environment even more. To not go to work, to not go to school, to not go to church, to not go out on dates, or to not travel if we are sick, if we possess any symptoms. And just an anecdote, we know that from one country, for example, kids already know how to fake a positive COVID antigen test to avoid going to school. Okay? So it's the responsibleness for going out healthy is also in. Now moving to the local government units, to the national, regional, and global levels, health systems have been impacted in varying degrees, depending on social cultural practices, educational awareness, positive regard for a good balance between health and economy, as well as science and religion. But before continuing on to the impact on the region's health systems, I'd just like to mention two success cases in Southeast Asia, because in the Asean region, two countries, health systems were able to overcome COVID-19 early on in the pandemic before vaccines. And these are Singapore and Vietnam. So Singapore's healthcare system, as we all know, is a top quality versus Vietnam, coming from an LMIC, low to middle income country, but was better prepared because of its past experience with SARS. And therefore, it was able to act immediately. Both offered free testing and treatment, respected their citizens, and therefore gained trust while minimizing excessive pandemic profiteering. Singapore's strength, as we observed, appeared to be in mass testing and cluster announcements. So the citizenry were aware of what places to avoid, what places were healthy, safe to go to. Vietnam, on the other hand, emphasized respectful cultural behavior and implemented, not merely trained, third-degree contact tracing successfully. Okay, so while the two nations' approaches differed, the approaches were appropriate for their sovereign borders, with common strategies being heightened awareness and responsible citizenry. So national awareness and responsibleness are in. Also, what is respectfully appropriate for each culture. And we look forward to hearing updated details from the country reports shortly. Now, moving on, unfortunately, it seemed to be a losing battle for most of our political, economic, and health leaders, who have been chained to wave after wave of variants, because regardless of the pandemic measures taken alongside the evolving scientific explanations, the shape of a wave is exactly that, a wave, lasting anywhere from 2 to 3 months to dissipate, as we have recently witnessed in Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Vietnam. Hospitals have been overburdened, especially because frontline healthcare workers' numbers have been decreasing due to multiple factors: deaths, burnouts, inadequate protection or compensation, transfers, migration. I would just like to mention at this point how some other regions, countries, have solved inadequate numbers of medical and health personnel in the past. So, for example, Tanzania has successfully trained underboards, meaning not yet licensed, for special healthcare needs programs through modular programs, therefore granting junior licenses, for example, junior MDs, junior RNs. Why couldn't this be done for emergencies and pandemics, kind of like a reserve health corps? And in fact, we do know that some countries do uh, utilize reserve health corps created not only by governments, but also through service organizations where medical and health professionals volunteer their services either part-time or for a month or two every year, kind of like a direct giving back to the community. Now, health systems here have been plagued further, unfortunately, with lawsuits for mismanagement and corruption. As mentioned earlier, it is really very difficult for any government, any administration to battle against the pandemic amidst changing science, also eager mass media, and impatient political forces and populations. So about political issues, some suggestions, if not being done already, are to track publicly and transparently the donations of health funds without unnecessary backlash from opposition. About the daily dissemination of COVID figures, how much stress would be caused if new cases were reported in real values as percent population rather than absolute figures. So for example, in Jakarta, I can buy a can of diet soda for 9,000 compared to in the US for 119. But in Jakarta, in Indonesia, that's IDR, and in the US, it's USD. So it makes a big difference what kind of denomination we are talking about, how large each country's population is, not just the absolute figures. Okay, further, what's more important is the hospitalizations, our hospitalizations and deaths, where or how they are being acquired and by which groups. And of course, the transmission rate, and not only of COVID, but also other diseases as well. So for the statisticians, are we correct in comparing hospitalizations of vaccinated versus unvaccinated, while the unvaccinated populations are still bigger? Would it be more discerning as new data evolves, as we have observed already, to compare hospitalizations and deaths of a wholly vaccinated area in the near future to the wholly unvaccinated group during the early pandemic? We would expect all of these numbers to be more serious in the urban areas as compared to the rural. So why all the fear and mandate requirements across the board? In fact, the long-awaited exodus would be for companies and populations to move away from the congested cities to the suburbs and countrysides. So we notice that not all countries in Asia have mandates yet. Some are still traveling freely without the need for excessive requirements. And so that brings us to travel, the health economics of travel. To make a long story short, not everyone can take vaccines. Variants are susceptible, varying degrees to the vaccines. Efficient and effective rapid diagnostic tests are readily available. COVID is not the only transmissible disease. Airports and airlines, the safeguards are already in place. The percent of new cases from international travelers in many countries is now extremely low, especially compared to the community transmission. And economic health is suffering, which causes other kinds of deaths. So as a physician, I've noticed during COVID that we have moved tremendously to telemedicine, as Dr. McGann has mentioned, using technology. But with regard to solving some of these solutions of international health travel, we often certify fit to work, fit to compete, fit to climb Mount Fuji, for example. Why not just accept a medical certificate of fit to travel? A travel medicine physician, a quarantine physician, an airport physician, an infectious disease specialist, a primary care or family physician, any appropriate physician will be signing his or her license on that paper using the guidelines and evidence provided with the personal touch of personally knowing the traveler. Even before the pandemic, wouldn't the fit to travel make sense? So in closing, again, area thanks you for the opportunity to participate in this Asia Summit and looks forward to each member states conferring on sharing best practices. Thank you.
Dr. McGann, I believe you're muted.
Antonio, it's quite comprehensive, covering a range of issues associated with COVID. I want to thank you for taking the time. We now move on to the state of the Asian economy. Pleased to have Dean Sunebe from ADBI give us the overview on the Asian economy and the impact that COVID has had on it. Dean?
Thank you, Jim, for organizing this important summit, the nice opening remarks, and for moderating our discussion. Thanks also for this opportunity to share some of ADBI's findings and thoughts with fellow think tank colleagues and other participants on the impact of the pandemic on the regional economy in Asia. I'll begin with the macroeconomic issues, then briefly touch on supply chain, financial market, public debt, and then I will turn to microeconomic issues such as household economy, food security, income inequality, education, and conclude with sustainability issues. As to macroeconomy, we have seen various gains during 2021 in Asia as a whole, even though there is considerable heterogeneity among sub-regions arising from differences in dependence on tourism and vaccine deployment. The growth recovery in Asia is underpinned by renewed export flows in 2021, which has been fueled by rising external demand and the repair to supply chains, including the shortage of semiconductor supply. Turning to financial market in Asia, let me remind you that there was the initial COVID-19 shock to Asian financial market in March 2020. After that episode, however, net portfolio flows to emerging Asian economies stabilized, generally speaking. Exceptions were some net outflows in early this year, which were related to renewed waves of infections and monetary policy development in the United States. Although some economists are concerned about the potential for taper tantrum in emerging market economies, the normalization of monetary policy in the US is unlikely to provoke excessive volatility in financial market in Asia, because fundamentals in the Asian economies are strong, including large foreign reserves to draw on. Equity markets in Asia have recovered during 2021. The recovery was underpinned by accommodative monetary policy in the region and ample liquidity conditions. The next topic is public debt. As you know, there was substantial increases in public debt to GDP from 2019 to 2020 in many countries in the world, including emerging economies in Asia. The public debt to GDP ratio in emerging Asia, however, is only a little more than 67%, which is much lower than the global average, which is over 95%. So in summary, the overall picture of the macroeconomy of Asia is not too bad. Instead, problems are found in income distribution of population in each country or economy, especially in the lower end of income distribution. According to the household surveys conducted by ADBI in 8 ASEAN countries, 75% of households in the nationally representative samples saw income declines in the first half of 2020 due to the pandemic. We also found that 44% of households had at least one household member who lost job or reduced working hours significantly, and that 33% of households saw income declines of more than 25%. And ADBI's rural household survey in Bangladesh detected traces of food stockpiling, and that caused food price hikes, making it more difficult for poor people to take sufficient nutrition. The household data obtained through these surveys provide ample evidence that those people from lower socioeconomic status were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. With this finding, question naturally arises as to whether government aid was well targeted and effective. Our results are mixed about this question. The ratio of the amount of government aid received by the people compared or relative to pre-pandemic monthly income tends to be highest among low-income groups, which suggests that aid was relatively well targeted. There is also evidence that some countries, including Pakistan and Bangladesh, succeeded in quick cash transfer to vulnerable groups. Nonetheless, poverty and food insecurity increased even in Asia, not just in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. So let's hope that this is just a temporary setback of the region's efforts to reduce poverty and food insecurity. As we all know, the long-run achievement of poverty reduction depends on the existing education gap and the investments in education for future. In this respect, Asia and the Pacific has had some problems. That is, prolonged school closures and uneven access to technology resulted in learning losses in most of the region. It's clear that the government in the region need to work hard to bridge digital divide by investing physical and human capital in order to increase social inclusion. One may ask, how about income difference between countries in Asia? Population-weighted estimations show that COVID-19 has reversed the trend of falling income inequality between countries. This was mainly driven by economic contraction in India, although considerably offset by China's positive growth. I turn finally to sustainability issues, which are very hot now because of COP26. You may know that 2020 was a remarkable year. It saw a record high level of global investment in low carbon energy transition technologies, which include renewable energy, electrified transport, electrified heat, energy storage, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage. Asia and the Pacific account for about half of global investment in these technologies. In the world as a whole, investment in renewable energy tended to grow a little more slowly than investment in the other types of low-carbon energy transition technologies in recent years. In Asia, however, renewable energy investments began growing faster in recent years. Looking at the source of investment finance, global issuance of green bonds increased from $275 billion in entire 2020 to $337 billion in just the first 8 months of this year. And the growth of green bond issuance in Asia even faster. So it is fair to say that the region is doing well in the sustainable respect. To wrap up, let me classify prosperity into 3 categories. That is economic, environmental, and social prosperity. Then, available data seem to suggest that Asia is achieving economic prosperity and making rapid progress in environmental prosperity, but that the region may be setting back in terms of social prosperity. However, we should remember that we are in a difficult time, not just because of pandemic, but also increasingly severe climate change impacts. Asia and the Pacific has many countries with high levels of climate risk vulnerability. The world needs global cooperation and coordination more than ever. In this sense, it's fair to say that Asia can and should do more to increase environmental prosperity and make the Earth a better place to live. And there should be many ways in which think tanks in the region can and should help this respect and their respective countries, the regions, and beyond. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. McGann, if you could unmute yourself.
I keep forgetting. Dean, thank you very much. Like our opening presentation, an effective tour de force in terms of an overview of the impact of COVID on the Asian economies, both some bright spots and things that we need to be aware of and help policymakers and the public be prepared for. We now move on to the impact of COVID on business and consumption in Asia. We have Dr. Seong and Dr. Devesa from the McKinsey Global Institute from both China, since they're global, and their operations from both the China office and the office in Australia. Doctors?
Thank you very much, Professor Mekan. So it's our honor again to join the think tank summit and share our view. So Professor Sonobe gave us a very, very good overview on the broad economic impact and the economic status in terms of the recovery. So let us go deeper on the supply chain and consumption. So let me cover the supply chain topic, and consumption is a tricky topic, so I will let my colleague Tiago explain in more detail. So let me start with the supply chain. So 3 observations to share. So the first observation is about the supply chain resilience, the importance of supply chain resilience, and as a result, a strong regionalization trend over the past couple of years. So supply chain is now a CEO agenda. So it's not just a back office function anymore. And we've done a survey of global executives, and 93% of the respondents say that they are increasing their supply chain resilience, and 44% said that they would do so even at the expense of short-term profitability. And one way to increase resilience is through more regionalization or localization of supply chain. And because of this trend, Asian economies are getting even more connected to each other. So if you look at the trade happening in Asia, 60% of the trade is happening on an intra-regional basis. And ASEAN, the Association of South Asian Nations, now became China's largest trading partner for the first time, so overtaking the EU. And we all know that RCEP was signed last year, and the RCEP could be a facilitator of even more regional collaboration across Asia. So that's the first observation. Second observation is about the Asia's increasing role in global supply chain during the pandemic. Because of lockdowns everywhere in the world, there has been a big global supply chain gaps, and China and other Asian economies stepped up to fill the gap, right? So, for example, China had a record high trade surplus last year, and this year, year to date, China's export has increased by 33% compared to last year, same period. And also, despite all the news about trade disputes, the share of export to U.S. remained largely stable at around 17% or so. And this story is not just about China, right? So countries like Korea, Malaysia, Philippines, they also showed a strong rebound of their exports. So that's the second observation about Asia's increasing role in the global supply chain. Third observation is about the geographic rebalancing of supply chains. And for many companies, pandemic was a wake-up call. And in fact, there are many other risks companies need to manage. For example, natural disaster, cyber attack, climate change, etc. And we've done a simulation in terms of how big the risk is, and we concluded that maybe around 45% of the 1 year's EBITDA every decade may disappear, because of combination of these supply chain shocks. And with increasing focus on risk management and evolution of the global economy, we think that maybe 16 to 26% of the global trade could be subject to geographic rebalancing over the next 5 years. And of course, this potential could be different by value chains. So for example, in apparel, about 35 to 60% of the export could shift to some area, whereas in chemical, only 5 to 10%. And throughout this process, companies will need to consider both economic factors as well as non-economic factors. And as Jim said, every crisis has an opportunity. So if your company or your countries are ready, then you may benefit from this supply chain movement. So that was a short overview on the supply chain, and Tiago can explain more on the other consumption.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jongmin. As Dr. Sono painted a very vivid picture of the impact of the pandemic on household incomes and consumption, the first fact to realize about consumption is that obviously we're facing a very difficult background. However, what our research has found is that there are glimmers of opportunity, specifically in Asia, when we take the longer term view about where we see consumption patterns growing. And there's basically an opportunity for Asia's consumption growth to be a big part of the Asia recovery story. So we'll basically leave you with 3 ideas regarding the post-pandemic consumption evolution. Number 1 is the cautious but strong consumption recovery that we're witnessing in Asia. In some countries like China, South Korea, and Indonesia, consumption levels have basically rebounded to close to where they were or even higher than they were pre-pandemic levels. So we do see potential for continued growth. Taking the longer term view, by 2030, our baseline projections show that roughly half of all consumption growth in the world is likely to take place in the Asia Pacific region. What does this mean? Basically, we could be talking about 1 billion more consumers entering Asia's consuming class over the next decade. So from 2 billion to 3 billion consumers by 2030. And it's not just obviously more people consuming, which is a good story in terms of access to the needs, but it's also a different type of consumption. And what we see is basically consumers going up the income pyramid. Over the past decade, around 80% of growth was concentrated in what we call the middle of the income pyramid. We see over the next decade the potential for 80% of consumption to actually come from the top of the income pyramid. So that's the first big idea. Consumption might be a bright spot over the next decade as we start to rebound. The second big idea is that it's not just obviously about the amounts of consumption, it's actually the nature of consumption. We see many shifts being introduced by the pandemic. I'll highlight one, which is the acceleration of digitization of consumers. And we're basically, it's not a new story, but we're basically seeing this acceleration playing out across every aspect of the consumer journeys. We see it in the type of products consumer buy. So for example, digital goods have been growing at 30 to 50% across Asia Pacific. We see it in the channels consumers prefer, and e-commerce and O2O models are basically becoming the majority of retail spend across many Asian countries. And we see thank you. And we see it even the way that consumers interact with the world. So basically, digital ecosystems are now covering more and more of consumer needs, and basically covering a very large proportion of consumers in Asia that basically have their first one-stop shop being a super app or another type of digital ecosystem. And it's not just the consumers that you might expect, the younger consumers. COVID has actually accelerated the uptake of digital consumption by the senior population. So in China, for example, the share of the online senior population has doubled over the last decade. In South Korea, Japan, Australia, we basically see over the next 5 to 10 years, 100% of seniors going fully online. And there might be a bright spot in this digitization story. What we've seen is that the business models that have accelerated and being enabled by this acceleration of digitization might actually, there's an opportunity that they might democratize consumption. What do we mean by this? Basically, if we take some of the business models such as ride-hailing, such as digital wallets, or even in entertainment such as mobile gaming, when you test the correlation of these business model penetration in different countries against income, it's actually fairly weak. What does this mean? It means that these business models are enabling even consumers at the lower end of incomes to fulfill needs that they wouldn't be able to do before. So if you compare these business models with the traditional alternatives that would be to actually own a car, to have a conventional bank account, to play games on a console or a PC, the barriers to entry for these consumers to being able to fulfill these needs have actually gone down. The third and final idea that we leave you with is that there's a lot of change coming from the pandemic. Not all of it will stick in the same way. What our research has illustrated is that some changes, such as, for example, home nesting, virtual healthcare, and e-groceries, are likely to be very sticky post-pandemic, whereas others, such as, for example, the slash in spending for travel or entertainment, are likely to be less sticky proportionately and actually rebound somewhat to the previous status quo. So what will influence stickiness? Basically, how much value is this change actually generating for consumers? How is the industry structure adjusted? And how have, crucially, governments acted from a regulatory and economic policy standpoint? So these are the three big ideas. And in a nutshell, what we're saying is that we do see potential for consumption in Asia to recover and be stronger than Asia, but it will obviously take a very different shape than what we were used to. We thank you very much for the opportunity to share our ideas and very much look forward to the next speakers.
Wonderful. As we continue with a series of fact-filled, critical information that we all need in terms of from various elements of the impact of the crisis. Another excellent presentation from our two colleagues from MGI, very helpful in understanding and differentiating between what will endure as a result of the crisis, what will be accelerated as a result of the crisis, and what will fade away as the crisis fades away. We now will look at the impact of COVID on international relations and cooperation in the region. And I'm very pleased that Simon Tay from the Singapore Institute for International Affairs will join us and provide an overview on the impact of COVID on international cooperation and relations. Simon?
Oh, thank you very much, Jim. Good evening, everyone. And to our Hindu friends, happy Deepavali. No one really should understate the impacts of COVID-19 on the human, social, and also economic factors. It's really been a very tough period here in ASEAN and Asia. But in the minutes I have with you, I'd like to share some other key issues as well. As Jim said, this is a kind of a hydra. There are different issues emerging. So I will touch on the politics of the region, ASEAN, regarding Myanmar, a really hot issue. Secondly, touch on some of the points about Sino-American competition and how it's playing out in this region, so between the two great powers. And thirdly, talk about the region I'm from, ASEAN, in terms of its centrality and potential. To give you the top notes, The surge of Delta variant has really been very strong from May to September. And as our earlier speaker has said, some of the health systems have really been overwhelmed. But there is a new and quite more positive stage arising. Risks continue with possible new surges, and also there are political risks. But the new stage that's arising will see opportunities and reasons to have some optimism as countries in the region start to reopen and to live with the COVID pandemic as being endemic, especially as their vaccination rates rise. And this will have opportunities not only to recover a lot of the ground lost, the economic and inequality issues, but to address education, competitiveness, efficiency and innovation in that sense, to try to make the reforms to really emerge more resilient, better, stronger, greener, as some of you talked about earlier, and certainly more digital. And I'll go into this now a bit more detail within the minutes I have, and also talk about how the Singapore Institute of International Affairs chair has tried to contribute. Allow me to begin with that hot political topic of Myanmar. As you know, a coup broke out in the country even as the pandemic started in February 2020, and it's not been resolved. In fact, the situation seems to be getting more unstable with continuing violence and a broadening of the conflict. At the same time, the pandemic numbers have been going up, and the efforts to vaccinate people during a time of conflict, of course, is extenuated. In terms of the regional group, ASEAN has appointed a special envoy and tried to help start a process of dialogue. The ASEAN summit had just concluded, and there were some concerns because ASEAN had decided not to invite the Myanmar military commander. ASEAN, to be clear, was willing to accept as civilian representatives, but Myanmar decided to not send anyone at all. This is quite unprecedented diplomacy here in ASEAN. The good points, I think, is that ASEAN has drawn a certain line about just what is to be decent and expected for all parties, including the military commander, to try to stop the violence. Secondly, to allow the special envoy of ASEAN to meet all parties. In particular, the ASEAN special envoy had asked to see Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, the deposed elected leader of that country, who is now being detained, and this had been refused. And thirdly, the ASEAN has shown unanimity. Now, ASEAN is not by any means a perfect democratic institution. Some countries are, like Indonesia, but others, like Vietnam, Brunei itself, the current chairman, or nearby Cambodia, are not. And yet, ASEAN has drawn this line on these factors. At the same time, ASEAN has continued to try to help as much as it can to the humanitarian issues. And in this sense, to deal with the situation of the pandemic with an even-handed approach, rather than only to help the present military government. In the interest of time, let me move on. I don't think that Myanmar is solved by these steps, but ASEAN so far, in a sense, has managed it and tried to keep an even keel on this process, with the realism that really what happens in Myanmar depends primarily on the willingness of the participants and conflictual parties in that country to determine their own fate and willingness to compromise. The second factor I'll just talk briefly about is the Sino-American tensions and effect on trade and supply chains. I don't want to repeat what the McKinsey and ADBI have said, but basically the tensions are there, but in some ways they also have brought a silver lining. The ASEAN summit that finished last week showed this. China has stepped up not only in the real facts of trade and investment, but also to seek diplomatically step up to have a strategic partnership with ASEAN. At the same time, the US President Joe Biden has returned to a dialogue with ASEAN partners, and this is a positive development compared to his predecessor. You will remember that Australia is an important partner to the region, and Australia has had a pretty torrid time with China regarding its health diplomacy as well as its trade. But another sign of ASEAN's centrality and acceptability to all, Australia too has sought and obtained a step up in their relationship with ASEAN. So in this sense, ASEAN, far from perfect, has managed to retain this acceptability and centrality to all. I mention this particularly because the headlines will also talk this year about how the American under Biden have moved ahead with what they call the Quad and a new creation with a rather awkward name of AUKUS, Australia, UK, and the USA. I don't mean to deprecate these things. They are new and should be observed carefully. But it is too soon to say that somehow ASEAN is finished. The summit shows otherwise. The ASEAN is still very much involved. Bilaterally too, you can see this in the recent months in September. Both China and US were engaging ASEAN. In particular, Vice President Kamala Harris came to Singapore, my country, as well as to Vietnam. In the same month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited the same two countries. The Sino-American tensions, in this sense, are creating this turn to ASEAN. The competition has also led to some degree of vaccine diplomacy. Again, this is sometimes viewed as competitive and negative. But like Vietnam, they have been able to actually mobilize help from both sides. And this has been helpful to the region. Similarly, in supply chains, ASEAN has really been trying to restart the supply chains that the McKinsey people talked about, primarily because we have been part of this China plus one strategy. ASEAN is trying to anchor various supply chains, including higher-end semiconductors, etc., in our region. Let me turn to the last point in the interest of time. This is another very important but lesser-known part of the ASEAN summit. As I mentioned, May to September have seen a really tough time for many countries in the region. Health systems, especially in Indonesia and Malaysia, were overwhelmed. However, the summit has now marked that all countries are moving towards reopening. Vaccination levels have come up very nicely. My country has some of the highest levels. So does, maybe surprising to you, Cambodia. Malaysia, after that terrible time they have had, has now reached over 70% of vaccination rates among adults. And so, not quite fully prepared, but ready or not, countries are reopening. You will still see the first signs in terms of tourism, especially in countries like Thailand, where it is so tourism reliant. There will be some risks, but with vaccinations going up and some safeguards, I think this is still positive. The economic costs are otherwise too high. The growth rates, therefore, will come up as the vaccination come up. And I think that as with tourism being the sort of canary in the coal mine, there will be wider flows. Indonesia's president at last week's summit, President Jokowi, has called for ASEAN travel corridors to be agreed in principle and move ahead. So really, this region has seen some of the largest flow of people across borders pre-pandemic, and this will be a very important step to restart. The effort then is to not just to recover, but to reform and move ahead. The SWI think tank has been working on the Myanmar issue with the special envoy, and more than that, has been looking at the reform issue, especially for Singapore with its emerging stronger task force. The recommendation of both the official task force as well as the SWIA is that regionalization becomes even more important, and the reopening of the region, therefore, is an opportunity for Singapore and our regional partners to try to move ahead, reform and adjust and grow. There are risks. Each country will have to make sure their health systems are not again overwhelmed. While rates of cases have plateaued, they are far from over. There are also emerging political risks. A number of countries have experienced political infighting before the pandemic, and this has sharpened during the pandemic. With reopening, not just economic activity, but political activity, protests in the streets can very well resume. It will be a challenging time ahead, but I think compared to where we were just 3 short months ago, the region of ASEAN is looking more optimistic, and with good reason. Our partnerships with the rest of the world, especially with China, Japan, and Korea will benefit from this. Please allow me to stop there, Jim.
Simon, thank you. The tour de force of this panel continues with your presentation and a wonderful overview of the state of international relations and cooperation. We now turn to the issue of social welfare and the impact of this crisis on the poor. I would point out that in 2020, the World Bank projected that 150 million people would slip into extreme poverty as a result of the COVID crisis. In 2021, the World Bank increased that estimate to 400 million people will slip into extreme poverty. And what a number of you have mentioned is that while the recovery, and there are many very positive signs in terms of the presentations, the reality is that the recovery and the impact of this crisis is uneven and inequitably distributed in terms of the severity on those who are least likely to be able to adapt and sustain themselves during the crisis, therefore slipping into poverty, and the advances that have accelerated in terms of technology, etc., will not be as available to those populations. So we now turn to Faisal Sultan, a special advisor to the Minister for Public Health in Pakistan, to help us assess further the impact on Asia, and particularly on the vulnerable populations as a result of the COVID crisis. Faisal?
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak and share. I will be talking in three broad dimensions and domains about the socioeconomic impact, the impact on the health systems, and that on education. So first, socioeconomic. So before COVID started, before its outbreak, about a quarter of Pakistani households, which is about 49 million people, were estimated to be moderately or severely food insecure. Before the virus, the poverty rate in Pakistan had actually declined from 40% about 2 decades ago to about 24% in 2015. And this actually meant that we had lifted about 30 million people from multidimensional poverty between the years 2005 to 2015. That still meant that around 50 million people still live below the national poverty line. However, these gains have been eroded due to the macroeconomic crisis that came in the wake of COVID-19. So we took undertook a number of steps, including a vulnerability assessment right at the onset of the pandemic, which prompted us to prepare for around 126 million people who were vulnerable to the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. Now, implementing lockdowns. Now, pre-COVID, about 55.7 million people were working in Pakistan, and this number dropped to 35 million after the first lockdown between April and July 2020. So these 20.6 million people could not work due to restrictions that were directly related to the lockdowns. So last year, in the wake of the pandemic, the government adopted a three-pronged strategy. 1, saving lives. 2, saving livelihoods. And 3, salvaging the economy. So while facing a tax revenue loss, which was upwards of rupees 900 billion, Pakistan distributed 1.2 trillion in stimulus packages for industries and another 350 billion as relief to informal work sector and poor families. Quite simultaneously, a COVID-19 secretariat was formed at the Planning Commission, which then worked independently but also synergistically with the UN partners as they technically supported a comprehensive socioeconomic impact assessment with the ultimate aim to, of course, put in place of an evidence-driven COVID-19 response mitigation framework. Early into the pandemic, the Planning Commission approved an amount of about $238 million US dollars from the World Bank and endorsed another 350 million from the Asian Development Bank for emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic and to, of course, mitigate the socioeconomic disruption that came with it. By October last year, through development partners and donors, we had actually mobilized loans, grants, and budgetary support to the total value of about 3.8, just short of 3.8 billion US dollars, out of which $3 billion were actually dispersed. We used the SDGs as a tool to reassess our fiscal flows and identify the ways to actually streamline funding to accelerate the Agenda 2030 and identifying the financing gaps and where streamlining was actually required. We increased BISP, the annual disbursement under the Asas Kafalat program, from 16 billion rupees in the year 2008-9 to 160 billion as part of what is called the Asas Emergency Cash Assistance Program for the fiscal year 2021. We also launched the Asas Emergency Cash Program to help poor families which were directly affected by COVID-19. And under this program, 15 million beneficiary families were disbursed 12,000 rupees each as a one-time emergency cash grant. And this was the program was lauded globally at the World Economic Forum. We approved the Pakistan Crisis Resilient Social Protection Program to advance Pakistan's social protection system and to make it an adaptive crisis resilient system. And the program is to the tune of about $800 million, and it builds on making a crisis resilient delivery system, developing innovative hybrid social protection, and of course protecting human capital in the early and primary school years. Through the Asas Amdan, which is income, National Poverty Graduation Program, Government of Pakistan and IFAD funded to the tune of US 150 million, in which the Government of Pakistan put in 50 million and IFAD 100 million, a program that a total of 20,000 productive assets have been transferred to the ultra-poor and vulnerable households identified as per criteria set in 338 union councils. 17.5 million rupees worth of loans were dispersed through the National Poverty Graduation Initiative, with 46% of these to women. Switching to health. While continuing to face the crisis, the government had not only to protect health and budgetary allocations, but commit to critical strategic projects, including stronger health systems, pandemic preparedness, universal health cover, and the Sehat Sahulat health protection schemes. So overall, Pakistan is spending 410% higher in the current year than in the previous years on health. And this is also thrice the amount of total funds spent on health in the last 3 years. So this is a historical high, and it aligns with our fundamental mission. The recent lifting of international travel restrictions for Pakistan is reflective of the government's trust in the endeavors taken by the country. A national command and control center was set up under the Prime Minister for information collation, decision making, and response tracking. And the federal government allocated 70 billion rupees for COVID-related response based on detailed rapid health facility assessments and to reach out to development partners for available regional and global knowledge-based and evidence-based reform interventions. Nearly 38 billion to the provinces was given as part of the umbrella PC1 from the Planning Ministry for special initiatives to strengthen infectious disease management and associated health systems. On education,
please wrap up at this point. We need to save time for Q&A. Your final remarks.
So being the fifth largest country, we have 140 million people, and our objective has been to leave no one behind. And as I speak, a countrywide youth and expert consultation is underway to develop youth priority agenda, which focuses on creating opportunities for decent work and reducing inequalities. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much for stepping in for the minister this morning. We now have the opportunity for questions on the regional overview of the economic, international relations, public health crisis in the region. And so we have a number of questions, and I'll read some of them. I'd first like to ask the panel in terms of what are some of the one major take-home in terms of the impact of this crisis and the intersecting hydra components of the crisis that you see. But first, we have a question from TDRI any observations from the panelists on the changes of the way governments do their work / transformations, etc., as a result of the pandemic? What impact has this had on governments and their responsiveness? Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better? Anyone from the panel who would like to take that question?
Jim, may I?
Sure.
Simon Tay from Singapore. Yes.
Yes.
So quickly, communication has been very important. And of course, communication depends on accuracy and understanding of the data and of the science. There's been so much misinformation and so much fear and anxiety that unless governments really try and get out in front of the information and to present it on a regular basis, communicate to their people, it's really been very, very tough to keep that centrality, a unity of purpose. This has, I think, been key, not just for Singapore, but for every country going through this time. The second, and this is the hard one to do anything about in the middle of the storm, is that a lot of the differences has related to the legitimacy and kind of acceptability of the governments before the pandemic. If you look at Indonesia, President Jokowi has gone through a very tough time. Indonesia has had record numbers at one point. However, the support and sort of confidence level, while it slipped, has remained very high. Partly this is because he's revamped his cabinet, given more attention to it, and tried to move ahead. So I would say those are the two factors. The third, of course, is again the delivery mechanism. Singapore, the country I'm in, is very fortunate not just to have sufficient reserves. Gillian will speak more of this, and I don't want to preempt her, but the ability to kind of target various people, given our small population size and the kind of very detailed bureaucracy we have. The problem with countries with informal sectors and much larger populations has been much more difficult.
Thank you, Simon. I would point out that the election results yesterday underscore, and certainly the message from Biden to his colleagues in the Democratic Party is you really need to deliver. And in terms of the infrastructure and the building back better, the failure of the Democratic Party to get its act together and to deliver policy has had a profound impact on the elections. That lesson is, I think, for every country. We have a question from Andreas Kramer at the Ecologic Institute in Germany. On the question, so this is for our colleagues from MGI, but others can chime in. With several trillion US dollars sitting in household current accounts waiting to be spent in Asia, how are governments in Asia proposing to ensure that the consumption is shifted out of the current unsustainable patterns of production, trade, and consumption and into more sustainable patterns? Are there initiatives to reform consumption taxes or subsidies and other incentives that currently favor dirty and wasteful practices and into more greener and sustainable practices?
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is a great observation. So I see two forces at the same time. One is this top-down, government policy-driven push, and another one is impact from the market. So in terms of government push, it is category by category, right? So for example, in Beijing or Shanghai, big cities in China, it is almost impossible to buy a internal combustion engine car because you cannot get a license, right? So therefore you have to buy, to some degree, you are forced to buy the electric vehicle and green vehicles, right? So that's one way to make the changes, from the policy side. Another one is market driven. A lot of companies that we interact in China, they are concerned about sustainability issue and how they will be perceived by the consumers. Therefore, they make great push in terms of reducing the waste and improving their packaging, etc., so that they can remain competitive in the market. So those are my observations.
Okay.
I'd
So
like to
Yes, of
Sorry, Jim.
course. Gene,
I'd
no
like
problem.
to add, I'd like to add one factor, which is increasing popularity of ESG investment, which will be, a great driving force toward the more sustainable, Earth. And then the
Can you
government.
explain what ESG? Can you explain what ESG is for those who may not know, just in terms of the acronym?
Environment, society, and governance investment. So, and then what the government should do is increase the transparency. So making the clear guidelines and the regulation framework. And then the ESG, investments will lead to a better world.
Great. Any other input on that? So I'd like to close this session with a lightning round in terms of what we have learned from the impact of COVID across countries and societies in Asia and in the sectors in which you are experts. What's the one take-home that you want each person who is here today from all the leading think tanks in Asia? What's your message? The one thing that is the take-home that we should learn and improve and incorporate into policies as a result of this crisis? Antonio, do you want to lead off, or
Okay.
anyone want to?
Just to make it short,
Okay.
for the take home, for health, very important in the region to share best practices that have been learned, especially sharing early on. We saw during the pandemic that although there have been regional, even ASEAN committees that are targeted directly, specifically for the pandemic, we found that the most countries, almost all, were understandably internally focused, trying to stabilize their own countries. So while some countries were able to successfully, as we mentioned earlier, tackle the consequences of the pandemic, it would really help internationally if there could be more frequent forums like this one, different levels, to share best practices moving forward. And definitely it is necessary now, as some other speakers have mentioned, that there will be new variants and new pandemics. Thank you.
Okay, so we have time for one or
Jim, could I jump on that, Jim, just for 1 minute? I think that one of the contexts we have is Asia here, but in a global summit which you are organizing. And if you look at it, one reason why ASEAN and many other countries in the region lagged behind was they could not get vaccines. COVAX has failed. It's been too slow. Instead, we've seen a huge grab by the developed countries, which have more than enough vaccines. And this global inequity, I think, needs to be addressed by Asia collectively. Okay.
One more comment, and then we have to move on because I want to try to keep this train on time. There's not a...
I'll try. Let me give it a shot. So in continuation with
focusing on the region, please.
Yes. So I think one of the lessons out of this, at least for Pakistan, which is applicable to not just the region, but to other large federal countries with big populations, and you mentioned the US, is the need for a coherent and data-driven decision-making that is able to reach out across to very large federal entities. That's been the challenge in large countries, and I think one of the lessons that we've learned out of our experience was that once you bridge that, you're able to bring back a coherent response, which is based on science, which then had dividends which were well beyond what our economic size would have indicated.
And related to that on a regional basis is, and connected to health, but I think across the board, is sharing best practices, and more importantly, the plans developed in terms of the health crisis The development of those and the implementation of those have been uneven in both Asia and across the globe. So ways of facilitating best practices and plans, especially in the health and in crisis, are key. I am now pleased to introduce and hand over the moderation and chair to the next session, and to Matt Sheehan, who is a fellow in the Asian program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Matt?
Great. Thanks so much, Jim, and thanks to all the panelists in the first session. That was really fascinating and enlightening, and it's really special to get so many perspectives from so many different countries and regions. I'll be very brief here in the introductions because I'm sure we want to get and hear the speakers. This next panel is going to focus on general assessment and recommendations related to the impact of COVID on public health, on economic development, and on international relations. So we're going to ask the speakers who represent 9 different countries to give us general recommendations for how to deal with the ongoing sort of crises induced by COVID-19 over the next coming years. We have 9 speakers from 9 different countries, 9 different cultures and languages. I'd consider myself passable in just 2 out of the 9, so I will do my absolute best with pronunciation of names and institutions, but if I slip up there, please forgive me and then correct me and repeat your own name in the way that it should be pronounced. With that said, we'll go first to the China country report. This will come from Dong Wang, who's a professor at the School of International Studies and the executive director at the Institute for Global Cooperation and Understanding at Peking University. So I'll hand it off to Professor Wang.
Thank you, Matt. And thank you so much, Jim, for the kind invitation. It is my distinct honor to attend this year's Asia Think Tank Summit. In the 5 minutes I have, I would like to briefly share my observations about the impact of COVID-19 to China, as well as China's responses to COVID. The COVID-19 has profoundly affected the economic and social development of China, and indeed has caused enormous disruptions and losses to the whole world. China has responded to the pandemic proactively, prioritized prevention and control of the virus, as well as the treatment of the patients, established an efficient command and coordination system, deployed all resources at disposal to the control of the pandemic, and achieved remarkable results. In terms of public health strategy, China has carried out rapid and large-scale social mobilization at the very early stage of the pandemic, paying close attention to the 4 groups of people, namely the diagnosed patients, the suspected patients, the fever patients, and the close contacts of confirmed patients. Having community at the grid, China carried out intensive and rapid quarantine, testing, and treatment measures. Anti-epidemic measures such as mask wearing, social distance, and lockdown were implemented. Moreover, to manage the pandemic in accordance with the law, China quickly amended the law of the People's Republic of China on the prevention and control of infectious diseases by incorporating the COVID-19. The regulations and related bills at all levels of government were also amended to enhance their institutional capacity to respond to the pandemic. Taking a people-centered approach, China has mobilized resources to remodel and build many hospitals to treat COVID-19 patients. All diagnosed patients receive free treatment. Practice for the diagnosis, treatment, and control of COVID-19 were quickly compiled and shared, enhancing China's systemic capacity in battling COVID-19. In the field of vaccine research and development, Chinese universities and research institutions had collaborated with the government to make joint efforts to actively carry out scientific researches, adopt a variety of technical routes, and effectively promote vaccine research and development in China. In April 2020, the inactivated vaccine developed by Beijing Kersing Zhongwei Biotech was approved, and various batches of vaccine were put into production and use. As of October 2021, China had administered more than 2.26 billion doses of vaccines, reaching about 156.85 doses per 100 people nationwide. While trying to contain the outbreak, China China also took proactive measures to address economic challenges and safeguarding people's livelihoods. For example, the government has cut taxes for small and medium sized enterprises and self-import households to stabilize employment.
Please mute your mics, please. Sorry, Tom. You have a few more seconds to add. Sorry for the disruption.
Very quickly, I just want to say that on balance, Chinese economy grew. It grew negative to 6.8 in the first quarter of last year, but it quickly picked up. And on balance, last year, Chinese economy grew 2.3%, and rendering China the only major economy in the world to pocket a positive economic growth last year. So I think I have to wrap up very quickly here. I just want to say that although the COVID-19 has caused enormous damage worldwide, economically and socially, there is reason for optimism. As of September 2021, according to WHO data, there are 121 vaccines currently in clinical study, and at present there are nearly 7 billion cumulative doses of vaccinations worldwide, reaching more than 88 doses per 100 globally. So the development of vaccine technology, the increase of public awareness, the improvement of government's anti-epidemic policies, all added together will lead us to have a more positive attitude toward the future. So I believe that by working together, humankind will eventually prevail over the pandemic. We already see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you very much. I will chime in at the after 3 minutes to let you know you have 1 minute remaining. We have 9 speakers. We want to benefit from the regional overview, so please keep within the time limit. Wonderful in terms of the optimism and the opportunities that lie ahead, but we need to prepare also for the challenges. Matt.
Thanks very much. Our next speaker will be delivering the Korea Country Report. This will come from Jung-Hyun Kwan, who works as a fellow at the Korea Development Institute. So off to you.
Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to talk about COVID-19 condition in Korea. So the impact of COVID-19 varies across population groups, and especially larger burden has imposed on vulnerable populations in Korea. Also, COVID has exposed the weaknesses of Korean social protection system. So in this talk, I'd like to focus on these issues. So let me talk about the current coronavirus condition of Korea. As of today, November 1st, accumulated confirmed cases accounts for 0.7% of Korean population. So adoption of quarantine measures from the very early phase of the COVID-19 outbreak, such as 3T of test, trace, treatment, social distancing, have effectively contained the spread of coronavirus and prevented the collapse of medical system in Korea. However, these quarantine measures, especially social distancing, bear significant socioeconomic costs. That's why social distancing is not sustainable in the long term. And now Korea has embarked on living with Corona scheme from this Monday and eased the social distancing. So in terms of economic growth prospects, Korea is relatively fair. Real GDP is projected to increase by 4% in 2021. However, industries heavily reliant on human contact are hit especially hard and still going through hardship. Since low-skilled, irregular workers are more likely to work in these crisis-hit industries such as service sector, they are more likely to be unemployed and even to exit from the labor market as discouraged workers. Actually, the share of self-employed among workers is over 20% in Korean employment. This high level of self-employed is unique characteristics of Korean labor market, and self-employed are concentrated in service industries and are mostly negatively affected by social distancing measures. The closing business case is increasing. The number of self-employed declined by 6% in 2021 compared to 2020. Currently, Youth unemployment rate is 10% in Korea, which is the highest within last 3 years. Similar to the previous economic crisis experiences, COVID-19 can leave scarring effect to young generation who are entering the labor market during the recession with low future job market prospects in the long term. The COVID-19 crisis has revealed the weaknesses of social safety net of Korea, so thus enhancing inclusiveness of safety net is an important task for preparing the post-COVID-19 era. First, we need to make inclusive safety net for the working population. Korea does not have enough measure to protect the working population besides unemployment insurance. Also, self-employed who are mostly hit and some irregular workers who are mostly likely to be affected by COVID-19 crisis are not covered by unemployment insurance. The Korean government plans to provide relief funds for those small businesses and self-employed, but compared to other countries, the amount is small.
1 minute remaining.
Lack of sick pay in Korea also become a problem during the time requiring social distancing. Whether sick leave is available or not affects social distancing success. Some workers who barely can take sick leave and tough to secure distance in the workplace experienced group infections in workplaces in the early phase of COVID-19. So currently, Korean government plans to introduce sick pay system in the next year. So in sum, COVID-19 crisis have a greater impact on vulnerable groups in the society, and we Koreans need to strengthen the social protection system to attenuate the labor market disruptions and not to exacerbate the inequality of the society due to the crisis. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Next up for the Vietnam country report, we're going to move to Win An Duong, who is a director at the Central Institute for Economic Management, the Department for General Economic Issues and Integration Studies. Off to you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening from Hanoi. And in the short time allocated, I'm going to speak about 3 main points. The first about the impact of COVID-19 in Vietnam. The second issue is about the intention to promote economic integration. And the third one is the role of the think tank, including the CIEM, which is my institute. On the first point, the COVID-19 really struck us this year. I mean, we were among the few countries that would handle the COVID successfully last year, but from this year, when things start to change, we had the new variants, including the Delta. We had to struggle, and also I think we had to change the strategy gradually from zero COVID to safe adaptation. And the other part is that we also had to switch to promote rapid vaccination, but the progress across the provinces are not even, and so we have to prioritize different groups, including the major cities like Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh, and the elderly people, the working age people. But one challenge is with the vaccination progress in Vietnam is that we have to rely on support from partners, and for example, and some partners, for example, from the EU, did not prioritize the grants of vaccines to Vietnam because they think Vietnam was successful in COVID control in last year, and so they did not seem to think, okay, we need it now. And so in terms of economic impacts, we had a severe economic impact this year, and especially in the third quarter, when we had the GDP decrease by 6.2%, which is the biggest decrease in the past 2 decades in Vietnam. And we are awaiting the figure for this last quarter to avoid the technical recession. Other than that, when we start to reopen the economy, we also face some problem with the supply, with the disruption of labor supply, because many of the laborers fearing the prolonged adverse impact during the social distancing, so they start to get out the major cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh. So most of the big firms in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi, when they resume their operations, they face problem with recruiting labor because they could get like 40% of the labor needed for the production process. In the second point about the international economic integrations, we we emphasize the importance of economic integration at this stage because we know that Vietnam's economies remain largely closed during the COVID situation. So domestic demand is an issue. Then we need to try to seek demand to exploit the demand from external markets. And we understand that regional countries like China and others are recovering. So there's an opportunity to export to them. And
1 minute remaining.
And so we need also work together to promote the FTAs. And so we all see the progress with the RCEP and with the CPTPP. We also start to see interest from China and Chinese Taipei from last month. So this is an important policies in Vietnam that we will continue to make further endeavors in the next few years. The last point is the role in think tanks. I think we are still facing problem with moving with flying overseas. But I think the role of think tanks now is more important than ever. The first thing is we need to maintain the channels for cooperations. The second important issue is that each of the think tank has to innovate themselves. We can't think that this is an economic research institute, so they have to focus only on economics. They have to expand the scope to work on non-traditional issue as well. And the third issue is this is unprecedented moment, and so there could be some unprecedented role for the think tank. For example, my institute is also given a role in the APEC, so I make a decision there for Vietnam at the APEC Economic Committee, and from last year until this year, I led the team in APEC to develop a regional program to promote structural reforms, and I think that fit in with the ideas of promoting further cooperation in the region in this uncertain context. And I think that is the key point I want to share. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Thanks so much. Next up, we're going to go to the Malaysia country report, and this will be delivered by Harizal Hazri, the Chief Executive of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. Off to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to share a little bit about Malaysia. In this very short time that I have, I will attempt to cover a few big tickets, I think, on how Malaysia have responded in terms of trying to put its economy back to be competitive after the impact that COVID has had. First of all, I'd like to also say that Malaysia is seeing itself in the road to recovery. We are now looking at around 3.8% of positivity rate out of around 165,000 tests that is being made on a daily basis. That's actually a very good news from a positivity rate of around 11% just 2 months ago. And at the back of that, the government has also announced and is still being debated at the parliament now, but has announced the plans for next year in its annual budget tabling. From there, we can see how the government is actually focusing on the areas that the government are actually focusing in terms of how it is actually reacting to this pandemic and the plans moving forward. Number one is really to deepen the digital divide. To address the issue of the digital divide by deepening its investments in technology, because we have seen that this is one area where Malaysia has seen growth, during the pandemic. However, as we all know, that the pandemic impacts different groups differently. So there are marginalized groups in Malaysia that are not able to play a role, to be involved due to the inability for them to actively participate in the digital sphere. The second area is to really look into digital trade and how the government has to be more agile in terms of producing or crafting new policies to support digital trade. I think this is one area where Malaysia is lacking, and addressing this would enhance digital trade in the country. The third really is in terms of strengthening technology to support the comeback of different sectors of the economy that will form a more solid supply chain sector. We have seen that some of the sectors in Malaysia was really badly affected. Therefore, it has really hurt Malaysia's exports in the last 2 years. The second area that I wanted to share very quickly is in terms of expanding social security net. Malaysia is known as one of the countries that has a wide ranging as well as quite deep social security net in the past. However, we've seen new sectors that came up over the last 10 years, which we call the gig economy, and many people who are involved in this sector wasn't really covered within the social security programs that Malaysia has. They are the most affected during the pandemic, and the government is investing in terms of social security, expanding the social security net. Obviously, strengthening public health gets a lot of possible funding as well, because this is obviously one area we are not seeing the end of the pandemic. There are new strains, and Malaysia is trying to prepare itself for what's coming. I want to touch a little bit on the international area affairs. And two things that Malaysia has looked into, or at least tried to participate actively since the pandemic, and also a reaction to the pandemic, is number one, to try and set up a group of like-minded countries to be together in a coalition that addresses food insecurity. It already has a few countries that are interested to be part of it. But really, this is to try and mitigate the issues of food insecurity, not just in Malaysia, but across the region, if another crisis such as COVID appear again. And the last area that I wanted to touch is Malaysia's response to vaccine inequity. Malaysia is quite lucky. Today, we are at 95.7% of fully vaccinated adults in Malaysia. But we know for sure that many countries have not received enough vaccines, and Malaysia has and will continue to play a role in terms of voicing this concern out and work towards addressing this issue. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Next up, we will be going to the Pakistan country report. And for that, we will turn to Hussein Nadim. All yours.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Jim, and the excellent team at TTCSP. It's my honor to be actually here and presenting the case on Pakistan. Most of the stuff related to data has already been shared by my colleague, Dr. Faisal Sultan. So I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 different things. One, the data. The second, decision-making during uncertainty. And third thing is going to be the lessons we've learned so far out of this entire pandemic. The data I want to share right now is not the numbers that I've already shared by Dr. Faisal Sultan, but I want to bring some comparative analysis on this subject, because that is where the analysis is going to start. We took a case study of Punjab, a province in Pakistan and a province in India, which is essentially cuts across the borderline. The Punjab population in India is 27 million, and the deaths on COVID were 16,500. The population in Pakistani side of the Punjab is 110 million, and the deaths are 12,000. For over a long period of time, we were actually looking at the data sets from both sides of the country, and the results were actually so different, which made us realize one very important thing, that the data has failed, and all the projection tools and the predictive modeling that we developed around COVID is really not working. So the decision came down to us was essentially, how do we start taking decisions during a time of uncertainty? For Pakistan then, the key question was to go for a full lockdown or don't go for a full lockdown, because we were presented with 2 different pandemics. One was a COVID-19 and the other one was a poverty. If we would go down for a lockdown, a full lockdown, there were 65 million people that were essentially hand to mouth, who would be at risk. But if we won't go for a full lockdown in the early stages of the COVID-19, then we were not sure what type of result that would cause, because during that time, Spain and Italy were undergoing through serious problems. So it was essentially all about, in my opinion, a decision-making and the uncertainty. So what is actually that worked for Pakistan? One of the very important things I think Pakistan, and we realized that we learned, was that at the very top level, at the Prime Minister level and at the government level, there was no state of panic. So the Prime Minister was constantly talking about not panicking and all, because sometimes panic creates a lot more disorder, specifically in countries like Pakistan, where there are very urbanized centers and there are large ghettos as well. So panic could create a lot more problems for us. The second thing I think that worked for us was the civil-military integration in disaster management. We've been dealing with yearly floods, we've been dealing with earthquakes. So there was already an institutionalized structure where disaster management was already present. So things could be mobilized and smart lockdowns, which Pakistan went for, were able to be enforced. The third thing I think which is very important is also the experience in vaccinations. Pakistan is one of the only countries that's still dealing with the polio vaccination. So that experience for the last few decades on the hepatitis vaccination and polio vaccination meant that Pakistan already had its tails around the country and the network around the country to be able to then undergo the vaccinations for COVID. Fourth thing I think which was very important was adaptability. The government was using data, but it was not completely trusting data because it was uncertainty. So it was quickly adapting as the new data was coming. So I think not having very rigid, hard structures of the government allowed the government to actually undertake a lot of adaptive measures in real time. And I think the last thing was actually the resilience in society which was there. Now, quickly coming to the political and economic health, in Pakistan, while there is politics on every single thing, luckily in Pakistan, the COVID actually brought down people together in terms of the economic, in the political sense. On the public health side, Pakistan is one of the countries which spends very little on the public health. But in COVID, the best part was that Pakistan finally recognized the need to spend on public health. In conclusion, there are both positive and negatives in this case, but I think the COVID-19, what Pakistan has been presented with, has brought a more empathy at the state and the institutional level to start realizing that it has to develop, to spend more on the public health side and more on the sides of the development of resilience of the government institutions. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. That was really interesting. Next up, we're going to go to the Thailand country report, and this will come from Girida Palpichit. They're the director of the TDRI Economic Intelligence Service at the Thailand Development Research Institute. All yours.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Thanks, Jim, as well, for inviting me. Well, I'm going to go really quickly on the overview of the impact of COVID-19 on Thailand, both on the health side, on the economic side, social, and also the politics. So it's going to be a really quick ride here. On the health side, as we know that the biggest wave of COVID-19 outbreak that hit Thailand was actually in April this year until about September. So we had a very high rates of contraction, and that actually amount to around 3% of our population being infected with the COVID-19 pandemic. And vaccination has actually has started in a big way only in July. So until now we have had 50% of our population fully vaccinated, and we are hoping that by the end of the year 70% will be vaccinated. So of course with all this happening this year, we're seeing a very slow recovery of the Thai economy. Last year, the Thai economy contracted by 6.1%, and this year it will probably only recover, growing by less than 1%. We hope that next year things will get better because we have now started unlocking the domestic activities and also our tourism since the beginning of this year. So hopefully next year, but again, we will not get back to our 2019 economic level or GDP level until the year 2023. So the COVID-19 has hit us pretty hard, and that's mainly because the lockdown has limited, the consumption within the country. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused supply disruption, production disruptions as well, and also because tourism, which is around 12% of Thailand's GDP, could not come, into the country since last year. So these have a big impact. So hopefully next year things will be better than next year will be better than this year. But again, as I mentioned, it won't be back to 2019 level until 2023. So the government has actually tried to step in and help by giving fiscal stimulus, which had amounted to about 7.5% of GDP so far. So that's not too big, but that's not small either. But I think one of the lessons learned is that the government stimulus here is in the forms of cash handouts. And it's not so much in terms of small investment in villages and communities or to support, jobs in SMEs, in small and medium enterprises. And I think that's something that could be done in the future if the government wants to prop up the economy for next year, for example. So on the social side, of course, we have seen, unemployment rising, twice the rate before COVID-19. We have seen those, who still have positions but zero working hours, also rising. About almost 1 million people who have no working hours, but they still have their positions. And of course, poverty went up. About 1.2 million more Thais fell into poverty, according to World Bank estimates, since the pandemic hit us last year. Of course, inequality has widened because this pandemic has hit the lower income households more than the higher income households who are still able to, maintain their jobs by working online or working from home. But poorer people can't really work from home. And of course, this is also exacerbated inequality in education as well, because those children from rich families could study online, but those from poorer families cannot even afford a cell phone, to study online. So inequality has widened in many dimensions as well. So here again, I just want to
very little time remaining.
Yes, I just want to say that lastly, so all this has caused pretty much of unhappiness in the country. So you can hear more news about unrest in Thailand. The younger generation are coming out on the streets, and you'll probably hear more and more of this. So all of that, I just wanted to conclude about Thailand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very interesting. I think we can all identify with that unhappiness that has been going around the last year. Next up, we'll go to the Singapore Country Report. This will come from Gillian Cove, the Deputy Director for Research and a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies.
Thank you so much. And hello from Singapore, which is a small city-state. Here we have a phrase that says, "Only the paranoid survive." So I just want to shape my remarks around the issue of being prepared for something we know we do not know about. And I think the story about Singapore's response to COVID starts with lessons learned from SARS, which was 2003. And the idea really I want to share with you is to have redundancy. In a world which is just in time, we need to now shift in a period of uncertainty to a just in case mode. But do we have the luxury? And in Singapore, we do not have the luxury of not preparing for emergencies like COVID. And so SARS taught us that we needed redundancy in infrastructure. So we had the public health infectious disease facility bumped up by 10 times for something like disease X. We had healthcare professionals on infectious disease bump up from 17 to 70 people. So that's what we have today. Now, not just on public health issues, but really connecting to international intelligence networks. So with SARS, we come very close to WHO's global response to pandemic system. And so we are there contributing our information so that we're not free riders, but also therefore drawing on that information. With that, it allowed Singapore to be part of a system to be early buyers of prospective vaccines. And so that provided us a preparedness for when the vaccines were ready. And Singapore received the vaccines in December. We are now 84% vaccinated using the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, with some proportion of Sinovac, which we also had advanced purchase agreements on. So that's on the healthcare side. But now redundancy on the fiscal reserves part. And I think that many younger generation of Singaporeans wondered why our pioneer generation in 1965 said, we've got a tax, we've got to put money away for a rainy day. So the rainy day arrived in February 2020. And the budget since February 2020 till now has been, for COVID, has been something to the order of $100 billion in order to respond to the healthcare, economic, and social aspects of COVID-19. So the fiscal reserves have been there, and they've been targeted at helping companies with wage support. By doing that, you are helping people, you're helping companies afford the jobs and the workers that they need to maintain business and ensure it goes on. That
1 minute remaining.
Economic resilience has also meant that, we've not had lockdowns, but because we are prepared to work from home and do school from home, we had what we call a circuit breaker. And so in terms of supply chains, Singapore could also therefore continue to play its role, especially in the biopharma industries, to supply what we need. In the IT manufacturing, that we could also continue what we were dependent upon to supply to the global value chain. Finally, on the social redundancy part, believe it or not, we had a general election in July 2020. And if not for the reservoir of trust in government over these long years, decades of PAP being in power, I think that the PAP would have seen a far more severe outcome as a result of COVID in spite of that performance. What it saw was an 8.7% decline in support of it, but coming out of it, the silver lining is that we have far more opposition politicians in Parliament today, which resulted in the PAP not designating a leader of the opposition in Parliament to ensure that alternative points of view on economics, on fiscal management, on social issues would be expressed, and that there would continue to be some level of political and social trust. Why? Because guess what? All of us know that the public health and safety measures for COVID require acceptance and compliance. Without the political reserves and reservoirs of trust and the social compliance, Singapore would not be today at the position of having only 20% of its total population exposed and infected by COVID, and a 0.2% level or measure of deaths of all those who were infected. Therefore, that is the outcome of having the foresight, taking the action to be prepared, having the redundancy in terms of the fiscal, economic, political, and social redundancy of whatever are those resources in order to survive something that we knew we did not know about. So that is the long and short of the Singapore Status Report. I have far more details, but I could say this to end. We suffered a decline of 5% in our GDP growth last year as a result of COVID. This year, the projections are for 6 to 7% growth. Last year, unemployment of our citizens was about 4% in September, 4.9%. This September, the unemployment of citizens is 3.7%. So things have improved. Finally, we've done a survey of opinion, 22 waves of 300 people since April 2020. This is the kicker. When people trust government and there is a level of government satisfaction
You need
in
to wrap
government,
up here.
and secondly, there's a better individual level of health and well-being, the support for public health measures for COVID were higher. So the relationship is one that is mutually reinforcing. Thank you for your time.
All right, thanks very much. We've got 2 more presentations left, and we have just about 6 minutes, so we'll try to keep these really concise. Next up is the Indonesia Country Report from Andri Suryanta, who's an associate researcher at the Center for Indonesian Policy Studies.
Thank you, Matt and Jim. And it's such an honor to share the virtual stage with so many think tank leaders across the region. So I'll get right into it because of time. Just a bit of scene setting. Indonesia health system is usually characterized as under-resourced, both in terms of funding and human resources. Our health expenditure is just 3% of our GDP, and mostly comes from the private sector. Our healthcare support industry, which is pharmaceutical and medical devices, are also usually focused on low-cost, big volume products. So not really known for innovation or research and development, or much less a biotech product like vaccine. Well, in fact, we only have one vaccine manufacturer that is over 100 years old now, right? So we have a very small public health system facing a huge public health crisis. Now, some other speakers already highlight our struggle with the second wave in May to August that overwhelmed our hospitals. Well, thankfully, that has passed now. And so we are looking at just case numbers below 1,000 daily now. And our bed occupancy ratio is only below 10% in most provinces. 60% of our adult population has been vaccinated at